My name is Chris Yee, and I'm making a 3D puzzle platformer called Nectar. In the game, you play as a potted sunflower with his bumblebee companion, using globs of nectar to grow plants and manipulate the world. I've been working on the game for about 6 months now, and I've made a lot of progress. In this video, I'm going to talk about the art style and the environment. One of the first things you'll notice is that whenever you're in the range of Nectar, everything is cel-shaded. The character is cel-shaded, the environment is cel-shaded, the grass, everything. And when you're out of the radius, everything goes back to normal. Now, this is a case of the art style actually influencing the gameplay. When I was first figuring out what I wanted the game to look like, I considered making things cel-shaded, and I played around with different techniques. At one point, I was thinking of making just the character cel-shaded, and then everything else would be not cel-shaded. And this was before I even knew what the gameplay was going to be. I didn't know that Nectar was going to be a thing, that growing plants was going to be a thing. I was really just trying to figure out what I wanted the character to look like. And in playing around with the cel shading of the character, I discovered something called a sphere mask. It's basically something in post-processing that allows you to mask out certain things within a spherical volume. And I discovered that I can make things within the sphere mask cel-shaded and things out of the sphere mask not cel-shaded. And that's what sparked the idea for the Nectar in the first place. The idea of everything out of the sphere being dead and desolate, and everything in the sphere being full of life and vibrant with color. That idea was very appealing to me, and the art style was very appealing to the eyes. And I figured you could probably turn this into a gameplay mechanic, and that's when I came up with this Nectar mechanic. So that's sort of the genesis of the cel shading look versus the look outside of the sphere. I've tweaked it around a little bit. I experimented with different versions of cel shading, 3 shades, 2 shades. At one point I had like 5 different shades of varying shadows within the cel shading, but eventually I reverted back to just the 2 shades. I think the simpler look lends itself better just to the way everything looks in general, at least for my game and what I'm going for. It's a good contrast to the outside world outside of the cel shading. And I use the same post-processing sphere mask to grow all the grass that's around you. If it's outside of the sphere mask, it's still there, it's just rendered as a transparent object. I'm still trying to figure out how to optimize that a little bit, because right now it still renders all the grass that you don't actually see. It's still there, you just don't see it. And that does take up performance. I'm still trying to figure out how to call the grass from the origin of the Nectar in Unreal. As far as I can tell, there's no way to do it with blueprints, and it gets a little more complicated trying to do it with custom code. I'm not a great coder, so I don't know if there are any suggestions on how to solve that. Let me know and I'll play around with it. But for now, I just have to settle with rendering the transparent grass. It still runs at a decent frame rate, so I'm not too concerned right now, but if it becomes an issue later on, I might have to look into other options. Getting more into the grass, I did experiment with lots of different looks for the grass. This is one of my original versions of the grass, and you can see it looks a lot more static. I think these are actually mega scans, so they're like photorealistic grass scans. And it was good for the testing phases just to figure out how the Nectar was going to work. But overall, it wasn't really the look I was going for. I played around with the length of the grass a lot. Eventually, I ended up making the grass a lot longer. I wanted the grass to feel really dense and not patchy. Obviously, that affects performance because you have a lot of grass instances throughout the world that have to get rendered. And I originally had grass cards with alpha channels on them, but I looked into it a little more, and overdraw was an issue with the overlapping transparency of the grass cards, and eventually I switched to grass meshes. I converted all my grass cards to grass meshes, basically just cutting out all the transparency by hand. That's how I did it. And although it adds some vertices to the grass, it does ultimately save on performance just because there's no overdraw. I also think it looks a little better than the grass cards as well. Now for the grass blowing in the wind, I experimented a lot with this, and I owe a lot of the look to my grass to tutorials made by PrismaticaDev. So thank you, PrismaticaDev. He made a tutorial about making a custom grass wind shader. Unreal has a built-in one, but I didn't like the look of it. It uses some sort of noise texture to figure out what grass is being blown, and I just didn't like the way it looked. So this new one that I have is more uniform in the wind. It basically just looks like waves blowing through the grass. and I like the way it looked. It also has global control, so all I have to do if I want to make it stronger is change a number, and then all the grass and the trees are also affected by this. Everything gets blown more by the wind. And as you can tell, just adding wind to the grass and the trees really adds a lot to the environment and makes it feel a lot more alive. Now, one issue that I was having was that the grass wasn't interacting with the character at all, and it would just poke up through the character. I wanted tall grass, but I couldn't have tall grass if it was just clipping through the character. So again, PrismaticaDev has a tutorial about grass deformation, and it was pretty complicated. I spent a lot of time trying to get this right and messing it up a lot, but eventually I got it working. It basically uses a render target, which is, so there's a camera looking up at the landscape from down below, and it can detect where the player is, where any objects that I choose are, and it draws those objects in the character to a texture, and then it uses that texture to displace the grass. And the render target that I'm using actually takes into account the direction that the player is walking. So if you're walking to the left, the grass will fold to the left. If you're walking to the right, it'll fold to the right. And after adding this, the character really feels like part of the world now. And now that the grass isn't clipping through the character, I was actually able to make the grass longer. And with the longer grass, I was really able to start approaching the look that I was trying to achieve. And this particular render target fades after a few seconds, so if you run through the grass, it'll deform when you're running through it, but then after a while, it'll pop back up and start blowing in the wind again, and I really like the way that this looked. I spent a lot of time just running through the grass because I liked running through the grass. Now, I talked about the trees a little bit with the wind. I did experiment a lot with the trees as well, so I tried Megascan trees, but they ultimately weren't really what I was looking for. They are very hyper-realistic, so if you have a game where you're going for photorealism, those are perfect. For my game, I wasn't really going for photorealism, and the Megascan's trees did really inflate the size of my game in terms of memory. And I'm trying to keep my game fairly small with the memory it takes up, so the Megascan trees really weren't for me. I also tried Blender. There was a plugin in Blender that uses splines to create trees. I tried using that, and again, I couldn't really get that to work properly with Unreal. Maybe I was just doing it wrong. Which brings me to Treeit. Treeit is what I ended up going with. It's a free program that generates all sorts of trees. You just change parameters and then it generates a tree. And this was perfect for what I needed. I tried to keep my trees fairly simple. I did want a certain level of detail. I didn't want it to be too simple, but for the leaves, I went with the stylized approach. So each leaf is just a simplified leaf card. And I am kind of running into the same overdraw issue with the leaf cards. I haven't gone and converted them to meshes yet. It would be a lot of work just how the workflow is set up right now. If I figure out some other way to speed up that workflow, then I might go ahead and convert those leaf cards to meshes. But for now, I'm just using leaf cards, and I'm pretty happy with how the trees look now. I do have to watch performance, because if I add a lot of trees, it really does bog down the frame rate. I'm looking into the reasons for that. The overdraw could be one of the reasons. It also could have to do with the shadows. I looked into the GPU usage, and the shadows were a big part of that. So I may have to look into different options for handling the shadows of the trees. One thing that I'm not really happy with right now is the way that the cliffs look. I've been trying to figure out how I want to do the cliffs. Right now it's just the landscape material, and if it hits a certain slope, then it shifts to a cliff texture, but the cliff texture is still pretty flat. I know a lot of people put in cliff meshes instead of using the landscape. I've liked the results that I've seen from other people that do this, so this will probably be the way that I go. One thing that I haven't done yet that I do plan on doing is customizing the sky. Right now my sky is just the default sky that comes with Unreal Engine. I do want to make it a little more stylized. I've looked into how to do this a little bit, and I have some ideas for how I want to do it, but I just have to play around with it a little bit first. What I have done is add some post-processed fog, and it's actually stylized fog. I was inspired by a GDC talk by the people that made Firewatch. They implemented something similar to this, where the fog changes color based on the distance from the player, and it creates a very stylized look. So here's some footage without any fog, And then here's the footage with fog added. And you can see that it adds a lot of atmosphere. It also helps kind of conceal some of the things in the distance so that I don't have to render them in full detail. And then the fog goes away when it's in the Nectar. So there's a good contrast between the fog in the desolate areas versus no fog in all the vibrant, colorful areas. And the stylized fog allows me to kind of change the mood of the scene if I want to. I can change the color based on what mood I want. Right now it's kind of a brownish orangish tint, but if I want something different, I can change it to blues, greens, and I might end up doing that in different levels if I want to elicit different emotions. I also made rain because I intend on having a level completely based around rain. Currently the Nectar is deactivated by water, so if you dunk it in a body of water, it'll deactivate and it'll just become a normal object until you reactivate it. But I'm going to have a rain level where you have to keep the Nectar out of the rain. So because I had this level in mind, I wanted to nail down the look of the rain first, just to make sure that I could achieve a look that I was happy with. And for the rain, I experimented with a few different things. I have a particle system that's above the character. Instead of having it over the entire map, it's just a small area that emits rain particles and it follows the character as you move. Because you really can't tell far off in the distance if there are particles being generated. It's really up close to the camera that matters. I tried to make splashes and ripples when the raindrops hit the ground. I used collision events to spawn more particles for the splashes and to generate a ripple effect. And this looked okay, but it wasn't exactly what I was looking for. And more particles just means that it hits the performance a little more. I ended up going with a different option. I use a 3D noise texture right now on all the materials. So in the shader of the ground material, I have a 3D noise texture that is constantly moving downward, and because it's a noise texture and it's 3D, it creates a lot of movement on the ground. And I fed this into the roughness property of the material. So parts of it look shiny and parts of it don't. And I think the resulting effect is that it looks like rain hitting the ground. It also has the bonus effect of surfaces that aren't completely flat. If they're sloped a little bit, it kind of looks like rain is sliding off the edge. And in bodies of water, I use the same technique with the 3D noise texture, but instead of plugging it into the roughness of the material, I plug it into the normals of the material. And this gives the effect of splashes and ripples in the water. And I'm pretty happy with how it looks right now. I'll have to figure out a way to negate the 3D noise texture because currently it still has the ripples and splashes when you're under cover from the rain. I did come up with a solution, but it involves creating sphere masks and box masks in the post-process material, and I have to do that manually for each object that is blocking the rain, which doesn't really seem that practical for a workflow. So I'm trying to figure out a more streamlined version of that. Maybe I'll look into render targets to detect rain cover. So that's everything that I've developed with the environment and the art style so far. I plan on having a very heavy environmental storytelling component of the game. The game is going to hint at a past war between robots and humans, so I plan on developing a bunch of assets for robot wreckage and war vehicles, tanks. I still have to figure out what I want the robots to look like, so I'll start developing that in the near future. It'll affect the way that some of my props and machinery look, so I have like a generator and a button and a laser. Those are all part of the puzzles that I'm going to build, but within the lore of the game, those are robot technologies, so I want to figure out what they're going to look like. But that's for the future. You'll probably see that in a future devlog, so if you want to stay updated on that, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell, and you will be notified of future videos. I also have a Steam page, so you can check that out and wishlist the game. And if you want to be part of the community, I have a Discord server. Thanks!